Joseph had plenty of reason to rationalize the advances of Potiphar's wife, but he didn't use the bitterness of past mistreatment as an excuse to sin.
Welcome to Mission 66, your daily journey through God's Word, powered by Bible teacher Dr. Luis Sayao and Transworld Radio. We're currently in the book of Genesis. Want to go deeper? Grab your free study guide at mission66.org. Now let's dive in with our teacher John Matthews and co-host Esther Sisulu.
Thank you for joining us in today's episode as together we look into the Bible chapter by chapter, coming today to Genesis 39. Now, many of the writers of the Bible struggled with the question, what good does it do to follow God? Because it seems that in this world, it's the nice guys who always finish last. It seems that it's the mean ones, or perhaps the loudest or the pushiest, who get all the best jobs and the most money. And the righteous sometimes are falsely accused and they go to prison, while the real criminals cheat the system and roam free. And that ultimately leads to us asking, well, does it really pay to follow Christ? Well, our teacher John Matthews will present the theme for today. Is it worth it to do right?
Esther, thank you so much. Great to be with you, and great to be with you all, wherever you join us from, for this latest episode of Mission 66, as we journey through the book of life, the Bible, which is God-breathed, faithful, holy men putting pen to paper and writing as they were carried and inspired by the Holy Spirit, as God saw to it that everything that was written was exactly the way that he wanted it to be. The Bible doesn't contain all the truth that there is to tell, but the Bible does tell us the truth, and we can trust it. And we began the story, didn't we, of Joseph's life in chapter 37, living with his father Jacob and his 11 brothers. And Jacob loved Joseph most of all, and it was evident, so evident that the brothers became envious of him, and they end up selling him into slavery to nomads who take him to Egypt, where he ends up in the house of the army officer Potiphar. And so let's pick up the story after he reaches the great Egypt of the Pharaohs. This is Genesis chapter 39. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who'd brought him there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favour in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of the entire house, put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him an overseer of the house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, Potiphar had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. Now remember, Joseph, being a slave, had no money of his own. All the blessings wherewith God had blessed him went into Potiphar's treasury. And the blessings of the livestock and the grain that was grown in the field all belonged to Potiphar, not Joseph. Now, the reason God blessed Joseph was so that the Egyptian Potiphar, who was probably an idol worshipper, would see that the God of Joseph was the one who gives blessings to those who honour him. What about us as we listen to Mission 66 today? Do we realise that all good things come from God? The money that we make, the food that we eat, the goods that we buy, it's all from God. To put it a different way, we're the caretakers of things that he entrusts to our care, much like Joseph was the caretaker of all the finances and the mundane blessings that came Potiphar's way. Now it says that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a while, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said to him, lie with me. But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house. He's put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. This is temptation. Joseph, being maybe about 17 or a little older at this time, clearly would have wrestled with this. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment and said, Lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand, and he fled, and he got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me, and he fled, and he got out of the house. And then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, This is the way that your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favour in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. And the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Joseph's innocence protected him no matter what. Potiphar had recognized the fine qualities of Joseph, recognized that God was with him, so put him in charge of the house. Now the keeper of the prison also quickly recognizes the qualities of this young man, not necessarily innate of themselves, but God-given. And so God is with him. And so what does the keeper of the prison do? Well, he does the same. He places Joseph in charge of everybody in the jail.
This is Mission 66, and we're looking at Genesis 39, where Joseph is unjustly accused and thrown in the prison in Egypt. I'm Esther, your host, and our teacher is John Matthews. And John, I have a very interesting question. Considering Joseph's upstanding character and reputation, do you think that perhaps Potiphar might have suspected that his wife was being dishonest?
Yeah, it is a good question, Esther, and maybe, I think is the answer, maybe. And there are two reasons why I say that. The first is that Potiphar knew Joseph by this time. He just knew him. He'd seen him day in, day out. He also clearly knew his wife. Now, unless I'm very wrong, he probably perhaps discerned that she had a roving eye, as she was the one who had instigated this, was very insistent with Joseph. And so his anger may well have been directed more toward her than toward Joseph, but he was embarrassed clearly by the whole scene. And so in order to keep up appearances in society, it was far easier, he thought, to lock the slave up than to deal with his wife, risk being embarrassed in public. And the second reason I mention that and say maybe is that I think Potiphar knew the truth. And the reason I say that is because he could easily have Joseph killed. And that would have been extremely common were a slave to have done this to his master's wife. In fact, that would have been the likely course of action. You know, he could have very, very easily had Joseph killed himself, could have snapped his fingers, summoned the guard. Joseph would have been executed. And perhaps some people expected that. But no, instead, he only puts him in prison. Better to cover the whole thing up. And you know, he may well have had a good idea that Joseph was innocent.
You know, I'm really trying to put myself in Joseph's shoes here, because if I were Joseph, I probably would have been overwhelmed with self-pity, thinking, well, you know what, I really committed myself to God. How could he have allowed me to be treated in this matter after I've resisted all of this temptation? Perhaps I should just, decide to do my own thing and live my own life. That's what I would have thought. And I wonder if that was Joseph's way of thinking as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, many of us have felt similar feelings in the past. And in many respects, Joseph had, justifiable reason to lament his past and indeed the unfortunate fate that had now befallen him through no fault of his own. In fact, Joseph had lots of reasons to rationalize the advances of Potiphar's wife. But isn't it interesting that Joseph doesn't use the bitterness of his past mistreatment as an excuse to go and sin? That's impressive. And this is one of the great lessons, I think, of the chapter. If anyone might have had a reason, an excuse to sin and forget God, well, Joseph certainly did. He'd been betrayed by his own brothers. They were ready to kill him. They sold him into slavery. He'd lost his parents, all the comforts of home. He's completely by himself in a strange land. Now he's being roughly treated in the slave market, taken to the house of an army officer as a common houseboy. Then he ends up in prison. And yet through it all, he retains his faith and his integrity. And his fine qualities, they're quickly noticed by everyone that he comes into contact with. I think that's an encouragement to us. The more intimate we are with God and the more his Holy Spirit is enabled in our lives and we allow that fruit of the Spirit to grow, it might seem a big thing, but actually it's not our work, it's God's work. And what happens is that others quickly notice there is something really different about this person. And that certainly is the case here with Joseph. And what happens? Well, God's grace and kindness is clearly with him in abundance. And so as a result, everything that he touches wherever he is, and they are places that he would ideally have not imagined he was going to end up as a slave in prison, but whatever he touches in these places prospers. And clearly, God's hand was on him. This is an example that God does not forsake those who follow him, whatever their physical circumstances.
And Joseph, I think, would have been justified in sinning with his master's wife, considering the fact that, she was the one who kind of suggested the idea to him. She kind of started it, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. She's the one who is coming on to him and badgering him, repeatedly. But Joseph, well, he was man enough to take responsibility for doing what he knew was right in a very difficult situation. But then by doing the right thing, you think, well, actually, will things get better? Well, actually, what happens is things go from bad to worse, seemingly, in terms of us looking on at the story. So he ends up in prison. Now, those prisons, they weren't known, Esther, for their cleanliness and their fresh aromas, far from it. And he didn't deserve to be there whatsoever. So we then ask ourselves the question, is it really worth it to do right? Look where he's ended up. When we read this story, we can certainly make comparisons, I think, to our own lives. As I speak to you and as you listen to Mission 66, I wonder whether it's ever cost you something to do the right thing. And maybe straight after doing that, you think, was that really, really worth it? History reveals that doing the right thing isn't always profitable right away, nor even in the medium term. And we often don't see the immediate, even the long-term benefits. But God sometimes has a plan that goes beyond the immediate. His will is often contrary to what we think things ought to be, to what we see with our limited eyesight. And God is the potter, and we are the clay. So as you listen to Mission 66 today, maybe you're feeling as though God has forgotten about you, even though you may well have suffered in order to do the right thing. What I say to you is don't give up. Don't give up. God certainly knows very well what he's doing. And I promise that later you will understand the why of what he was doing in your life. Tim Keller once said, "You don't really know Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have." Actually, Esther, there is no greater place for a human being to be than in that state. Let me say that again. You do not really know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. If Jesus is all you've got left, you have so much more than everything, and you have it forever.
Well, that's the truth that we can pick and take and hide in our hearts, because that's what we're going to need as we proceed through life, John. So Egypt, this is where Joseph was imprisoned, and it was clearly one of the great civilizations on earth. I think I'd like to get more of what ancient Egypt was like in Joseph's time.
Yes, you're right, Esther. Egypt was one of the great civilizations that we find here in the Bible. The book of Genesis focuses on Egypt, and it was a great power in ancient times. It was an extremely prosperous nation there in the region of Canaan. And one of the reasons why they prospered was the River Nile, because it provided field irrigation as well as plenty of fish. Egypt's society was considered more sophisticated with education, and they had the development of writing on papyrus. And they believed that their king, the King Pharaoh, was a divine being. So they were polytheistic, they had a god for everything, and they built many famous pyramids, and so they were extremely advanced in terms of the way they went about their lives at this time in history.
Now we know that Joseph arrives in Egypt as a teenager. Now, I'm sure you can imagine the teenage excitement and curiosities for what they're witnessing in this advanced world. I wonder how we can understand Joseph's particular faithfulness and how he, I suppose, restrained himself from not being seduced by the advanced society that he was in.
Yeah, and I think the answer to that question is the reason why Joseph's story is in the Bible. You know, he's different from all those people in history who went running down to Egypt to be a part of their trade, their worldly wealth, wanted to gain some of this sophistication for themselves. Joseph's eyes weren't fixed on the incredibly impressive offerings that ancient Egypt offered people, as impressive as they were and would have seemed to everybody. Joseph's eyes weren't fixed on those things. Joseph's eyes were fixed on the unseen, because he knew that the unseen was so much greater than what was seen. And it was his father Jacob who brought spiritual knowledge of the true God down there. And even though he would probably not have chosen this for himself, Joseph was going to be the spearhead of a great project which was initiated by God to make his fame great in all the world. This was actually, Esther, going to involve Egypt as well to a large extent.
Yeah. And John, Joseph's integrity under temptation, firstly, was absolutely inspiring, but I think it really is some sort of a rebuke against the immorality and perhaps even the hypocrisy of his brothers and the way they treated him, right?
No, not a rebuke, I don't think, no, but a beautiful contrast, a beautiful example of doing the right thing and what hanging in there and waiting on God leads to, as opposed to what the quick fix often leads to. A good example of this is that last episode where we were in chapter 38 and you have Joseph's brother Judah who goes into debauchery, and it results in 3 sons, 2 of whom were so wicked that God removes them from the earth. At the end of that chapter, Judah himself is caught with the evidence after having relations with his daughter-in-law. So you contrast Judah's profligate lifestyle with Joseph doing things the right way. He obeys God's moral law. Okay, he ends up in prison being falsely accused, and so it tempts us to ask as we read these 2 chapters, well, what good does it do to resist temptation? But wait, later on, we find that God honours the life of somebody who chooses to obey him in lavish ways. Sometimes we see it this side of eternity, but it's coming, maybe the other side of eternity, if not this side. God often allows us to suffer and go through problems as a test. He feels our pain. He doesn't want us to suffer, of course not, but sometimes he allows it because he is planning to exalt us to something important, something far more magnificent, just as he was doing here with Joseph.
Oh, John, I am really glad that you brought that up, because I'm so convinced that God really does bring us through these valleys that we experience in our lives so that we'll gain experience, gain wisdom, gain knowledge, and perhaps even toughen us up.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of him giving us that wisdom and that experience. And I'm glad you mentioned that term, toughen us up, because in some ways he builds resilience in us. But this expression, toughen us up, I don't think that's a thing of God. And the reason, let me explain that. I think because the closer we become to God through the heat and the refinement of painful experience, the more we become like Jesus himself. What does that mean? What is the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of becoming more like Jesus? Well, we know the answer to that because it's made clear in the New Testament, and it explains it as the fruit of the Spirit are things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. That list doesn't include toughening up. In fact, I think toughening up is mostly a defense mechanism against bad things that have happened to us in the past. So we resolve, I'm going to be so tough next time in my strength. Now, understandable perhaps, but it's not God's way. When we become more like Jesus, the aroma that we carry is not toughening up. The aroma we carry is one of grace, compassion, strength, true strength, the strength to walk away when tempted as Joseph was tempted, the strength to forgive as we'll see Joseph forgive, the strength to die for the sins of the world when you have nothing that you deserve to die for, and do so when you're the only man who ever lived, the only perfect man who ever lived. That's what Jesus did. So it gains a world-changing strength, not putting on a tough human mask to fight back against the world. Joseph learnt what it was like to be hated, even by his brothers, and how to live with it. He learnt what it was like to be hungry and thirsty, to be thrown into a pit, so he could be more compassionate to people who were hungry. He knew what it was like to have to serve as a slave. He knew how to live in a different culture among the Egyptians. God knew, what he was doing when he allowed Joseph to be brought here. And God knows what he's doing when he allows trouble to arrive in our lives. Why? He knows it changes us from the inside out. It forms our character to be more like Jesus, a godlike character. So tough experiences and chapters in life, boy, are they unpleasant, but they change us and they form our character and they grow us up in ways that are not possible any other way. And if bad experiences cause us to pray more, then actually they are blessings in disguise.
And with that, John, isn't it amazing? It's quite amazing how Joseph just seemed to suffer this unjust punishment so calmly and so graciously. I mean, I can't say that I would have handled it in the same way that he did, but it truly is eye-opening for us.
Esther, thank you for your honesty, and I'm exactly the same. Neither can I. And you read the story, and I'm thinking, how on earth does he do this? How does he do it? But he did it. And there are situations, Esther, beyond our control where the truth is it doesn't do us any good to get into self-pity or harbour bitterness in our hearts over what's done to us. Sometimes we can prefer feeling bad to feeling nothing at all. And I think sometimes that's why we enter into self-pity. And sometimes society would look and say, well, they've got reason to feel sorry for themselves. But, unforgiveness and thoughts of revenge and ultimately even self-pity can be so destructive to our health. They're like poison. They can destroy us. They can destroy families. They keep us from any rewards we may have gotten if we were just patient and allowed God to do his work in us and around us. And I think it's even not an exaggeration to say we can wreck our chances in life by always giving vent to our rage, our anger. It happens frequently, doesn't it? In traffic, confession time here, we call it road rage. It never ends in anything good at all, does it? And so what is the harm in letting offences go and just trusting God to work it all out?
John, well, this has been an amazing study, and I know that there are so many takeaways that we can take from this. So let me give you the floor to summarize chapter 39.
Okay, well, we ask, is it really worth doing the right thing? How then do we define worth? It assumes that good results outweigh the cost of what we suffer. And from a human perspective, it makes no sense to give of our wealth and suffer outrage for doing good until we see that in following God, we are amassing treasure in heaven. Is that the prime goal? No. The prime goal is that when we become like Jesus, we are where he intended us to be all along, in a state of worshipping him. And what does that bring in our hearts? It brings a peace and a sense of coming home that nothing else even comes close to. So if we talk about truth, justice, reckoning, those things, they take a while to come forth, but they will come forth. But we shouldn't weigh the cost of the bad things, let's say, that happened to Joseph for doing good until we find out the benefits that are coming his way. And so we've yet to see in this story the result of God and the result that God brings about by having Joseph taken to Egypt against his will. And I reckon if Joseph could send a message to us here today, as we listen to Mission 66, I reckon it'd be this: yes, it was worth it. Yes, 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 1,000 times. We who follow Jesus can afford to forgive. We who follow Jesus can afford to patiently suffer treatment when we do not deserve that treatment. We can afford it because it's temporary. And we have a hope of eternal happiness. And it's not a flimsy hope. It is a sure hope. And that far outweighs today's pain. Truly, truly, it will be worth it all when we see Jesus and when we see him face to face, what a thought that is. We will be like him.
Thank you so much for that, John. And dear friends, we will be back again to see how Joseph, the dreamer of dreams, was able to interpret other people's dreams all the way into the very throne room of Pharaoh. And that will happen next time right here on Mission 66.
As Mission 66 comes to a close, be sure to download your free study guide at mission66.org. Deepen your daily devotion with insights from each episode, and let John and Esther lead you through the scriptures. Get your study guide at mission66.org and be prepared for our next episode. There, you can also connect with us, ask questions, or donate to help Mission 66's worldwide outreach. Head to mission66.org. Mission 66 is made possible through Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.